Good afternoon. My name is Grant White, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today for the fourth in our series of public lectures here at St. Ignatius on the different dimensions of the scholarship that the faculty at St. Ignatius are engaged in, and which provide a introduction to the areas in which our faculty do research and teaching. So I hope this finds you all well wherever you're joining us from today. And let me just say a couple of words about Michael. This is straight from our website, but it's worth perhaps just going with that. Michael Hjälm is the Dean of College and Senior Lecturer in Eastern Christian Studies at Stockholm School of Theology. He was previously the Director for the Department of Eastern Christian Studies and Culture at Studieförbundet Bilda for 12 years and was a Senior Lecturer. Sorry if I slaughtered the Swedish there. I'm still learning and was a Senior Lecturer at the University of Uppsala. Michael was born in Eskilstuna in Sweden. He holds a doctorate in theology and his research interests are in ecclesiology. He is especially interested in the ways in which the sociology of the church can help us to understand the way the church organizes itself. He believes that this can help us to find ways to integrate church organization and canon law with sociology and political science. Michael is the author of the book, The Ministry of the Bishop, Liberation of the Ecclesia, the Unfinished Project of Liturgical Theology, which was published in 2011. And he is the author of many articles and book chapters in scholarly journals and collections of essays having to do with a wide range of theological subjects having to do with the church. Today, Michael's lecture is titled, The Ministry of the Bishop, the Prime Ecclesial Challenge of Ecclesiological Studies. So, Michael, with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Today, I will talk about the ministry of a bishop, the most important challenge for ecclesiological studies. This subject is hardly dealt with in ecclesiology. It seems like we are dealing with a kind of almost sacred things that couldn't be discussed in principle, but still, it's the most important part of the church today. How the ministry of bishop is developing from now on and into the future will have a major impact on how the church will be organized and how it will be functioning in the future. It's almost like talking about the emperor's new clothes that we have from old tale. You know, remember the tale there, the emperor is dressed by a tailor in invisible clothes and he believes they are, something that he still have on him, but he's tricked. And everyone is seeing this, but he doesn't realize that he actually doesn't have any clothes on. But talking about the bishop is rather to talk about the emperor's old clothes, meaning that we have to address the question about the ministry of bishop is visualized in clothes that has a certain history, not just about the individual parts of his robe and clothes, but also something that reveals the understanding of the ministry of a bishop. This is a picture from the beginning of the 20th century, where Archbishop Athenagoras, later the patriarch, he is returning to America as a patriarch, and here he is visiting the American state, so to say. And you can see here he has a special robe on him. On the top, he has a mitre. He's carrying a staff, and then he has a huge band around him, which is called an omophorion. And he's also having special clothes that the bishops has. It's called sakos. And on the right side, you see what is called epigonation. All these robes has a history of ecclesiology. This is an icon painting in present Serbia in Belgrade, in the basement of Sveti Sava, Saint Sava in Belgrade. This is a copy of an older icon. And the interesting fact here is that we are seeing the Archbishop of Serbia, Saint Sava, on the left side, and we see the Emperor Lazar on the right side. And you see that the Emperor has a crown on his head, and he has a robe, a sakos, which also Saint Sava has. But what is different between them is that Archbishop Sava has the omophorion, the huge belt around his neck, so to say. One thing that strikes us immediately is that only the emperor is carrying a staff, a patisera. But we see that he has an epigonation on the left side, which is, in this time, is a sign in the 13th century of the bishop's ministry. If we take a step backwards, we reveal a quite interesting idea about this icon, because here we have the church in different periods of the church history. In the middle, we have the 13th century. On the right side, you have bishops with mitres. They are later, much later, after the fall of Constantinople, so to say. On the left side, we have one of the bishops standing here. He doesn't have a mitre. He doesn't have a sakos. He only has the omophorion as a sign. And underneath, it seems that he has an epigonation, which is probably not for that time, which is pictured here in this icon. We have three different periods. We have a medieval period, we have an early church period, and we also have the later church period after Saint Sava. And here we see the development of the robes of a bishop, a beginning in the priest, in the bishop, that the only sign that differs from present days priests are his omophorion. And then the medieval Saint Sava, which also have a sakos, and the epigonation, which is new at that time. And on the right side, we have the mitres coming in to the church history. This is an old picture of a bishop. This is from the time of the 6th century, where the bishop is John Chrysostom. And here we see clearly that the only thing that remains from later periods is the omophorion, the huge band around his neck. Tradition said that it should symbolize the idea that Christ is looking for the 100th sheep around his neck, which he carries. So it's a shepherd sign, which is the mark of this. But there's no staff, there's no mitre, there's no epigonation, and the clothes are ordinary clothes, if I would be adding this. And the only sign is the omophorion. This is from Meteora Monastery. Unfortunately, my camera at that time wasn't so good, but in this, you see the assembly of bishops from the first council, it's supposed to be. In the middle, you have the emperor. He has a crown, a mitre, and he has a sakos. He doesn't have a staff in his place. And you see around him the bishops wearing ordinary priestly clothes, but with the omophorion as a sign of the bishops in this. But it's one exception here, and that's the thing that the Archbishop of Alexandria is wearing. It's a kind of cap, which is very similar to mitre, and many scholars believe that the mitre were developing from Alexandria because of his image, but probably they have very little in common. It's a cap taken from a monastic habit, probably with ancient Jewish roots, which only were worn by the Archbishop of Alexandria. Shortly later on, it was understood as a sign of the authority of a teaching of a universal teaching authority, which was given to the Archbishop of Alexandria. Note, not to ancient Rome, but to the Archbishop of Alexandria. But that was a little bit later. The important thing here, he's the only one having this head cap on. The reason for this is lost later on, and this is a quotation from Simeon of Thessalonica, Saint Simeon of Thessalonica, and the questions to him is, why do bishops and priests, with the exception of the Alexandrian patriarchs, serve with uncovered heads, and why is it better to serve with an uncovered head? And Saint Simeon of Thessalonica answered, all Eastern hierarchs and priests, with the exception of the Alexandrian patriarch, conduct the sacred serving with uncovered heads. But perhaps somebody will ask whether it is not irreverent that the Alexandrian patriarch covers his head with the sacred covering, hieron epikalima, as do countless others in accordance with ancient tradition. I do not ask this, for those who act in this way, and it serves as a justification, act according to the most ancient, or more accurately, most lawful tradition. Actually, the lawful high priest wore on his head a turban, kidarin, which is called a mitre, mitra, as bishops who wear it like to call it. Perhaps they have it as the likeness of the image of a crown of thorns of a master and king, which was on his head. Historical work has shown that it's unclear if there is any real connection with this turban kidarin, but at least we know that the mitre is very late. So the question is how late the mitre would be, in fact. And the recent research we have show that the mitre appeared after the fall of Constantinople and continued throughout the Ottoman period to be spread from just one archbishop in Constantinople to all bishops, and then to the entire Orthodox realm, that all bishops carried the mitre. So it's a post fall of Constantinople which we're talking about here. It's quite late. The question, of course, is why this was introduced. I will take it later on, but this is the first regalia that we are seeing here for the bishop's ministry. The second is the sakos. We know clearly it was introduced from the 11th century as a gift from the emperor, and was later introduced first as in the mitre to one of the bishops, and later on to all the bishops as a sign of a gift from the emperor. And then it spread rapidly to all ends of the Orthodox Byzantine, ex-Byzantine world under the Ottoman period. Thirdly, we have a paterisa, or the staff. This is the one that has been held in quite historical, the evidence has been quite historical that the popular idea was that it was given to the Archbishop of Cyprus by Emperor Zenon. And according to historical tradition then, it was one of the three prerogatives of Archbishop of Cyprus given by Emperor Zenon. The first was that he carried a purple-red robe instead of a traditional black one. The second was that he was allowed to write or sign papers with the imperial red ink. And thirdly, that he was given a staff by the Emperor Zenon as a sign of his imperial power given by the emperor. This is the historical tradition that has been accorded later on in the medieval or the Renaissance history. And according to popular tradition, it was referring back to the rod of Moses, when Moses was placing a rod with a snake and it healed the people that were infected by the poisonous snakes in the desert. But we know today that it's the staff of Hermes, which was carried by the emperor, who had the right to summon the gods, which was an imperial sign, because Hermes was allowed to summon the gods, but he was not allowed to preside over the gods. That was Zeus' sole duty, to preside over the gods. And in fact, the emperor had the same prerogatives, that he could summon the gods, even if he couldn't hold the power over gods. He could summon the gods, which was the basement or the foundation for the Roman Empire. But more important today, recent history has shown that the free prerogatives given to Archbishop of Cyprus are much, much later. And we are talking about the second millennium, not the first millennium. So it means that all these imperial signs that has been traditionally assigned to the very early church are more or less a second millennium story, so to say, which means that these signs has very little to do with the old church, with the ancient church, except for one thing, and that is the homophorion. So, why was they given? Probably, and more research has to be done on this, but probably it was a sign that the emperor treated the church as an equal partner. So they showed equality. It meant simply that the emperor, by giving the sakos, by giving the pateris, or the staff, or by giving the mitre, he gave part of the power to the bishops, especially to the archbishop, so to say, the first bishop among the many. And thereby created a kind of idea of symphonia, a power sharing. But in reality, it seems that the intent was more to subordinate the church under his power. We have very few textual evidence of the meaning of this. The only thing is some few remnants where it's connected with the idea that there is a kind of community between the emperor and the archbishop. After the fall of Constantinople, it became extremely important, the equality with the emperor. The eternal realm of the empire continued through the church, and the signs of the imperial power was in the vesting of the bishops. And that's probably the reason why it spread so rapidly among Orthodox bishops, simply because it was about investing the church with the regalia and insignias of the empire, which had been lost on earth, but were still waiting for the church in heaven. But the usage was reduced to the liturgy. It was suppressed by the Ottomans, and it was the vestments were reduced to the liturgy, and more or less the church were not allowed to carry imperial regalia or signs outside the church or outside the liturgy. This also explains a lot of why the liturgy remained unbroken in this way of expressing imperial empire and in Ottoman Empire. And the liturgy became also an escape from present reality of a lost earthly paradise, a lost Byzantine paradise, so to say. It became a remembrance, a kind of artifact of the previous Byzantine Empire. And as such, it continued during the Ottoman period. And as you know, the Ottoman period is quite long. It remains from 1453, when the fall of Constantinople takes place, until 1915, which is a lot of 100 years that the church were thriving and developing. It continued in the Moscow Patriarchate as a sign of equality, where the Symphonia was addressed post the fall of Constantinople. But it was suppressed by Peter the Great already in 1700 in the prelude of absolute enlightenment, where the idea was that the emperor, the Tsar in Russia, was the one who protected both the church and the society. And everything about Symphonia was taken away, including the patriarch of the Moscow Patriarchate. But the clothes and the robes and the regalias were kept by the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate. This turned the church into kind of idea that the liturgy was a kind of light in the end of a very dark world. And an escape from all the present realities that was very harsh, especially in the Ottoman Empire, where everything surrounding the church was lost from the Byzantine Empire, but recovered in the liturgy as a light for the future, an eschatological sign, one would say. And then we have clear signs that eschatology and the idea of eschatology increases in many ways during this time. The poverty of the world, the problems we see in the world, was something that was not brought into the liturgy. Instead, it became a kind of demarcation or a distinction between the problems of this world and the hope of a future in the coming kingdom, so attached to the liturgy and also attached to the ministry of bishops. In Russia, the Tsar was understood himself as giving hope. It meant that he had lived a perfect life, far away from poverty and the problems we can see in the world. The same thing happened with the bishops. The bishops created a palace for the bishops, which signified hope for the poor people in the diocese in the same way as with the Tsar. And it also continued in the Ottoman Empire. The power and the insignias were supposed to show that there was a strength, there was a richness, there was something in the future that didn't belong to this world, and which would be something that the people of the church would harvest in a nearby coming future. This was the church that developed under oppression. And liturgy, even today, is the same. It's today, the liturgy is splendid, marvelous, beautiful, and something that amazes still people. And the bishop is clothed with a mitre, with a homophorion, with a sakos, with an epigonation, and carries an paterissa, which are the signs of emperor during the Byzantine Empire, and now are the signs of a lost kingdom, but a kingdom that will come back within the realm of the church. So, something happened in the 20th century after the fall of Ottoman Empire. 1915, we have placed the year when the Ottoman Empire was finally torn apart. And we have a new era where all the problems in the Middle East, soon later on, we had the rise of communism and so on. A few years of great expectation took place in Russia, but was soon quenched by the Bolsheviks. But in the second half of the 20th century, especially after the fall of the ex-Soviet Union, and the replacement of a totalitarian ideology for something new. And one of his signs has been now in the Orthodox Church has been an increased involvement in the world, which is also visible in the Great and Holy Council of Crete 2016. And this is taken directly from a text. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. The Church of Christ exists in the world, but is not of the world. The Church, as the body of the incarnate Logos of God, constitutes a living presence as a sign and image of a kingdom of a triune God in history, proclaims the good news of a new creation, of new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells, news of a world in which God will wipe away every tear from people's eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain. Here we have a kind of reflection on the idea that the great news, the great expectations in the future, in the coming kingdom. But at the same time, and this is, let's see now. Oh. Mhm. So, no. Okay. This foretaste of a new creation, of a world transfigured, is also experienced by the church and the countenance of her saints, who through their spiritual struggles and virtues have already revealed the image of the kingdom of God in this life, thereby proving and support and affirming that the expectation of a world of peace and I can't remove it, that's the problem. Yeah, but I don't see the pointer, that's a problem. No. 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 It's not utopia, but the substance of things hoped for, attainment through the grace of God and man's spiritual struggle. It means in some way that in this statement, there is both still this strong eschatological expectation, which has been the focus during the Ottoman era, and also partly during the long 20th century struggle within the Soviet Union. But it is also an expectation of a church more concerned with the world we are living in. And this also highlights and gives an example of a change in the second half of the 20th century. A church much more involved in the present day realities of the church. On the other hand, we see another sign of development after the Ottomans during the 20th century. First, we have Eucharistic ecclesiology. Eucharistic ecclesiology is said by Nikolai Athanasius the first time, where he expressed it in the following way: where the Eucharistic assembly is, there is the church, and where the church is, there is the Eucharistic assembly. This was something that influenced almost the entire Orthodox Church. It highlighted the essence of what was taking place. You know, the church had survived during the Ottoman Empire by celebrating the Eucharist, by continuously doing what they were suspected to do. And he also added, wherever the bishop appears, let the congregation be present. And we also highlighted the bishop. The bishop's main duty was to gathering the congregation, and which effect used the assembly. Therefore, we had two nexus of the church in the 20th century, the Eucharist and the bishop, which became kind of legacy for the 20th century onwards into the 21st century. But participation of the laity is missing. And it's striking that there is almost no theology in this era that actually concerns itself with the laity. It can concern itself with individuals, but the community, the laity, the responsibilities of the laity, the role of the laity is almost entirely missing in the beginning of the second half of the 20th century. And it's striking its omission of this part. Second trait in the 20th century is liturgical theology. The expression lex orandi est lex credendi, the law of prayer is the law of belief, appears in the second half of the 20th century, but it had its expression first time 1925 in a newspaper in Belgrade. Everything is in the liturgy was the slogan that priests, especially in America, after the work by Alexander Schmemann, one of the most prominent theologians during the 20th century. The idea that everything is in the liturgy created a kind of focusing on the liturgy that was also quite in line with what happened during the oppressions during the communist regime and the Ottomans. The liturgy even was the kingdom. Schmemann, in a famous quotation in a sermon, says that the liturgy is the kingdom, which was some years later a little bit amended by Schmemann, but he was quite convinced that the kingdom was in the liturgy. It was like a foretaste, but also the fulfillment of everything on earth. But the liturgy after the liturgy was suppressed. Nothing came out that dealt with the organization of the church. Nothing was dealt with how to organize the canons of a church. Nothing was dealt about how to organize international relations between various churches. And it's also meant increased clericalism, because focusing on the liturgy without any changes for the role of the laity meant an increased focus on the priests in the Orthodox tradition. And what we could say is that even though Alexander Schmemann tried to engage the laity, his liturgical theology increased clericalism. It also meant a conservation of views, meaning simply that nothing could change. Schmemann himself, he argued that we don't need to change anything, we just need a new understanding, meaning that everything should remain the same as it has been during the Ottoman period and during the oppression during the Soviet era. It just needed a new understanding. And this was also in support of the same regalias and everything that is connected with the bishops. Now, the third trait of the Ottomans is the ontological twist. And the main idea of this is expressed by John Cisioulas. It's expressed in John Cisioulas, and that's the bishop constitutes the many. And the many is the church then. And the idea that this became a kind of understanding that the church is primarily being, and even communion is being, or as he says, being is communion. This resulted in a distinction between is and ought disappeared. The meaning that since the church is good, is success, and is good, is beautiful, is. The ought, what the church ought to be, disappeared. Everything was about what is the church. And ecclesiology became the study of what is the church. What the church ought to be. How the church can be improved. The very idea of talking about improvement of a church meant a kind of denial of what the church is. And the bishop became the primary ontological criterion of the church in this trait during the 20th century, which meant simply that all ideas of a church were connected to the liturgy and the bishop, which meant that the bishop became the one who created the church in the liturgy by summoning them, or his representatives created church, which also meant an increased clericalism in the 20th century. Questions of leadership, organization, and governance became suppressed by the subsistence of a church in the liturgy. Even canon law became a target for this ontological twist. Canons were not interpreted as rules and regulations for how to improve a church or how to keep the church on track. Instead, they were interpreted as ontological criteria for what the church is. And the church eventually became trapped in an infinite being, which had the idea, which was not spoken of, but the idea that the church springs forth from the divine nature, incarnated by its people. Like there is a complete mediation between the being of the church and the practice of church, which has in philosophy and in political science been quite heavily criticized. But in theology, it's still something that is quite acceptable. No? Anyway, if my argument here now up to this point then is simply that the insignias, the imperial insignias, are a late second millennium development. They did not exist in that sense in the first millennium. And secondly, that it exploded after the fall of Constantinople and not before. It's after the fall of Constantinople that these insignias were carried away, so to say, and spread among the episcopacy of the Orthodox world. It's not just a matter of clothes being changed. It's also a matter of principles being changed. People being changed also. The first change, I would argue, is simply that the evangelical principle, which existed in the early church, which was the guiding principle of the early church, was lost in this change. And secondly, the emphasis on freedom was turned into an emphasis on unity and power instead of his freedom. St. Paul's letter to Philemon, as it's read, I'm sending him who is my very heart back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel. But I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favor you do would not seem forced, but would be voluntary. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. On the right side, you see the oldest excerpt from the letter to Philemon. Here in St. Paul's letter, the principle of freedom is accentuated, meaning that the difference between the law of the Old Testament and the evangelical principle of the New Testament or the new community, New Israel, is that we are not doing the law because we must, because we want to do it. He is not sending back Onesimus as a free man against his owner Philemon, but he's sending him back as a slave for Philemon freely to release him as a slave. This evangelical principles was quite organized in the early church. And still in the Arabic world, where Christianity spread under Islam, still maintained the principle of freedom, which is visible in various stories about the church. Okay. So, okay. Yeah. So the early church also revealed a structure of the community that was also missing after in second millennium. Ignatius of Antioch, he emphasized freedom and unity. And unity in his way of understanding was freedom and love. Love was a bond that unified the early church. So freedom and love became the two words that were the themes for the second century in the early church. And this is what he says to one of the parishes on his travel. Since therefore I have, in the persons before mentioned, beheld the whole multitude of you in faith and love, I exhort you to study to do all things with a divine harmony. While your bishop presides in the place of God and your presbyters in the place of assembly of apostles, along with your deacons, who are most dear to me, and are entrusted with the ministry of Jesus Christ, who was with the Father before the beginning of time, and in the end was revealed. Do ye all then imitate the same divine conduct, pay respect to one another, and let no one look upon his neighbor after the flesh. But do ye continue to love each other in Jesus Christ. Let nothing exist among you that may divide you, but be united with your bishop and those that preside over you as a type and evidence of your immortality. It's clear that in the early church, the structure of the early church mentions a ministry of Jesus Christ, but it's attached to the deacons. In the second millennium, it's attached to the priests. And it also mentioned the council of elders. which are a community, not individuals, but primarily a community. This is taken from the synagogue. This is a tablet from a synagogue of released ones, which is mentioned in Acts, which was located to the city of David in Jerusalem. Let's see if I have it. Here I have it. So this is a translation of his tablet. Theodotus, son of Vetanos, a priest, Jerevs. Jerevs here is not presbyteros, but Jerevs, meaning someone who served in the temple. And an archysynagogos, so the same priest is also an archysynagogos, son of an archysynagogos, grandson of an archysynagogos, built the synagogue for reading, anagnosin of Torah, Nomo, and for teaching, didachin, the commandments and Tolom. Furthermore, the hostel and the rooms and the water installation for lodging needy strangers. Its foundation stone was laid by his ancestors, the elders, presbytery, it's wrongly spelled there. And this signifies the Greek synagogue. You had an archysynagogos, which were surrounded by a council of elders and which was served by deacons. It's not mentioned here, but in another tablet in Kana. So if we reconstruct the early church, the synagogue became ecclesia. So we just changed the name. It more or less means the same thing. The archysynagogos became episcopos, overseer. So also changing the name, but the function remained. But the council of elders remained in the early church as representatives of the community. And this had a much stronger survival in the early church than we have believed before, and more research has to be done on this in this field. But we're talking about changes in the structure of the church that came to be part in the second millennium, which I will talk about later. The servants, deacons, was the eyes and ears of a bishop, representatives of a bishop, not of a community, but as of a bishop. And there was a power deal between the community and the bishop. So the bishop could not do anything without the community be represented by the council of elders, and the council of elders could not do anything without the bishop. A kind of democracy. Some call this ecclesiocracy, but I think that that word has so many meanings that it's hardly possible to use. So what happened then in the course of history, which has changed the shaping of a church? The council of elders became representatives of the bishop. We don't know exactly when this took place, but probably very early. Probably before the first Ecumenical Council 325. Instead of being a power deal with the bishop, they became completely suppressed by the bishop, and instead they became representatives of bishop, the eyes and ears of the bishop, while the deacons were reduced to liturgical functions, which took place much later, but fully developed in the end of the first millennium. The council of bishops became detached from the people, which became visible during the 7th ecumenical councils. The bishop became self-ruled and monarchical episcopacy, which had servants of deacons and priests, and became like he had one left hand and one right hand. And there were no council of elders left in the end of the first millennium church, so to say. And during the Byzantine Empire, the bishop became legates of the emperor or the patriarch if the patriarch was more powerful in certain periods. But the emperor took all the opportunities to make the church a kind of outstretched hand in the empire. The church went simply imperial, which then exploded, not during the Byzantine Empire, but after the fall of Constantinople. Imperial was the sign of a Byzantine church, but it also spread amongst various Oriental churches. And the empire continued in the church in the Ottoman Empire. Now, we have a renewed conciliarity, which is very late, during the latter 20th century. Democracy has replaced the feudal society, which was the beginning of the church history. The surrounding society in the early church was feudal, very much hierarchical, but changed in the Roman Empire. But the church was very much equality or equality or whatever you would call it. Parishes became democratically organized in the latter part of the 20th century. Most of the parishes simply went much more democratically organized, which is actually an explosion in the church history for the eastern part of Christianity. Catholics did not in so early now. So, in many dioceses, democratic structures and attributes were introduced, not in all, far from all. Many dioceses doesn't have any kind of democratic structure still in the Orthodox world, but it was introduced in various churches and dioceses. And in principle, the Council of Elders returned, but not the Council of Presbyters, but the Council of democratically elected people to various boards of churches. Diocesan councils were created, parish councils. This is something that we haven't even touched upon in research, which is a complete revolution in Orthodoxy during the last century, so to say. But challenge still remains. The culture of Orthodox Church is still very feudal, still based very much from a hierarchy from on top to below, which still images the empire. Meetings does not promote participation. It's not so much deciding together as someone is telling what to do, so to say. Ecclesiastical leaders are not trained to promote democracy or a culture of participation or anything like this. And even more, tradition does not motivate this, because we are looking back on centuries under the Ottoman regime or under the communist era, periods when the church has been oppressed. So we have to look way back into the first millennium to get any kind of inspiration that promotes democracy. The feudal structure provides a kind of escapism. Still, we have people that believe that orthodoxy would be destroyed if it in any way loses its hierarchical structure of this second early millennium type. The principle of freedom and love has also been substituted by obedience. In that sense, it has gone so far that we even have books published that talk about that obedience to Christ is a way towards salvation. And the idea that we have to freely do the law instead of just obeying has been lost in the wake of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And friends have become spectators for them. We need to know more about the historical development of episcopacy, structures of a church, to understand how everything has been turned around in the wave of the centuries. Just to say that the period of Ottoman Empire would be the ideal period, just because we have more bishops and mitres, I think would be a historical mistake. We have to look at the entire history, not just the Ottoman period. We have to understand the first millennium in a new form, not just look at individual saints or spiritualities, but also look at the structure of the church. Theological ceremonies needs to incorporate practical theological democracy and not just talk about ideas. We need a culture of participation in order to develop the church in the present day world. And we need to encourage the people to understand that in order to take part of a church, it's not just to go to the liturgy, to attend the service. There's a liturgy after the liturgy, which is also most important for the church to thrive and develop and be there in the midst of society. So there's a need of a liturgy after the liturgy, which in the end will give a new look towards the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that rich and multifaceted lecture, which, goodness, I filled up several pages of my notebook with notes and questions generated by your thoughts and observations. However, what I would like to do is to open the floor for questions to you. And I will simply take questions and convey them to you and ask you to address them, please. Would anyone care to begin? Well, if I may start then, just to prime the pump a little bit, I was very intrigued by your discussion of the development of the insignia of the bishop and the imperial dimensions of Orthodox liturgies, specifically the Byzantine liturgical tradition. But given that those things are the case, and given how closely they're tied to practices, ideas, views of the church and authority and the world that need to be changed, that need to be rethought, and what role there is there then, do you think, for the continuation of such symbols in Orthodox liturgical life today? What needs to be done in order to interpret them, address them?
Yes, as I said in the end, the first thing we need to understand, we need to look back to the history. And of course, in your field, the liturgical studies, there is a connection directly to this. And that's isolation of liturgy, or the reduction of a church to liturgy, where the institution of a church has even been so suppressed that it's even a bad thing to talk about the church as an institution. But the church is an institution. In the Roman Byzantine Empire, the church didn't need an institution because it had the surrounding society as an institution. It meant simply that the emperor was the institution of the church, and the liturgy was the cultic act of that institution. That changed dramatically during the Ottoman era. It meant simply that the church had to adopt to becoming an institution, but deprived of that experience for centuries under the Byzantine Empire, which meant simply that it had to invent its own role. And it took the power turn, meaning that you believed an institution is something that has power. But in a society where you didn't have power, it meant a very twisted way of being an institution. Today, we are in the 20th century, or in the 21st, but we are now heading towards or in. We have a situation that the church is a polis, a city within the city. It exists as an institution, a living institution. It cannot rely on the surrounding society, but still, the Orthodox Church is still trying to hold on to the idea that the surrounding society will provide the institution. That's the basis for ethnocentrism and ethnophilitism, and whatever you would call it. The patriarch is an ethnarch rather than a patriarch, so to say. It still continues, and still it's going forward. It's diminishing, I would say. We see signs, as I tried to show in this Sacred Council, but still serious studies has to be done. But also, we need new leadership that are eager to take on the challenge of seeing the church as a polis in itself.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to the next question we have, which is, thank you for a very interesting lecture. What would you say is the most important feature or features to look for in a future bishop, and also for the present bishops, for the Orthodox in the diaspora?
The future bishop, meaning?
Yes.
Yeah, that's not really my field. If Cyril here, I think he is better equipped as answering this question, because that comes very close to the actual experience of the bishops, which is more his field, I would say. But let me state the first, let's say, condition for this. First of all, I think the future bishops, they have to understand that the power game the Orthodox Church has adopted from the period under the Ottomans and under oppression, it won't work.
Mm-hmm.
It simply won't work. And that will have a lot of ramifications for how to be a bishop and how to be a priest and how to serve in church in general. But if Fausir is here, then he could complement with this, because I think he's the right person to answer that practical question about.
Yes, Father Cyril actually will be the next person to ask the question. So, Father Cyril?
You have to unmute yourself. So.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for a fascinating presentation. And I should say that your ideas have created a momentum which goes beyond Sweden. Just recently, a couple of days ago, there was a defense at the university here in Kiev on the liturgical theology of Father Alexander Schmemann, and I happened to read this dissertation, and it was full of quotes from your book and your ideas. So it's actually, your ideas go really international. They go wild. And I'd like, well, it's your forum, so probably it's not good for me to make my own presentation on the question that was asked, but I just want to ask you my own question. In the modern situation, a bishop in the modern world, let us imagine a bishop in the modern world in Sweden or in a traditional country or in Turkey, how would you envisage him being dressed? How that bishop would look like without necessarily maybe sakos and other imperial regalia? So how would you symbolize the power of bishop in the modern world through his appearance?
If it would be a new power game, there would be a red tie, a black suit, and then you would have an American president visualized in some sense, But I think that the first question is about, are the clothes really necessary? Are they ontologically necessary for the ministry of a bishop? Are they part of the terms for what it means to be an Orthodox church? If the answer is no, it means that it's an open discussion. But just to say that it's an open discussion, that actually we could change the mitre, we could change maybe the homophorion should be still there, because that's a kind of red thread through the history. But still, we could change it. But who would change it? That's the more important question. Who would actually be bold enough to change the emperor's old clothes into a new set of clothes? And that's problematic. Let's say that the Great and Holy Council would take this question seriously. I think there will be a split in the church. So attached are the clothes to the essence of a church, which makes me a little bit afraid that we have lost the real perspectives of what the essence of a church really is. And but I do think that the homophorion is a cloth that has remained through all the centuries. And the homophorion is so central, and the idea of homophorion is so central that it's a shepherd looking for, at least it's a later tradition, but it has some bearing on the truth, that it's a sign of the ministry of a bishop. And I think that's the clothes that I would say would be necessary for a bishop in my aesthetic thinking. But
well, this bishop looks very much like a Swedish Lutheran bishop.
We have broader homophorions, much broader homophorions. But the real question is it really essential? That's the real question for the Orthodox world. I think Dafra has a question. Can you? Do you have more questions, sir?
Yes. Yeah, I've got one more question here. Do you think the laity has something to say in this matter of clothes?
You mean should or has?
I think it's a should.
Yeah. I think it has a natural part of this because we are the ones looking at the bishop. It's not something outside the liturgy normally. It's more intimately connected to. So what is the bishop sending for signals to the people when he has his clothes on?
Mm-hmm.
In the Ottoman Empire, it was very clear. We have some few readings left, which is just the top of the mountain, meaning that they saw the splendor of a kingdom, and they didn't mean the common kingdom. They meant the lost kingdom of the Byzantines. It became later on a much more accentuated eschatological way of seeing it. I haven't prepared that part to have a quotation, but it means simply that this is not something we see today. Today we see it as a sign of a kingdom that will come, as an eschatology. Is that the kingdom that we would like to be, where we meet people with power? That's a question that would be raised. In 100 years from now, that question will be raised. I'm convinced about that. But the laity, as of now, they have no share in this discussion, I would say.
All right, thank you. Davar has a question, and I have another question here as well. So, Davar, would you like to go first?
Are you saying you go first?
Okay. How much do we have to learn from free churches in terms of laity participation / democracy?
In order to answer that question, I would be forced to know more about the free churches. So I would be very hesitant. I would say that we have a lot to learn from a society. I think in a lecture Cyril had several years ago, he said that let us have a society having an impact on us. That is better as of now. I think he's completely right in that. We have to take in the good development of society within the borders of the church. I think that's a necessity. We have to accept that the society is not something fallen only. It's also positive things that are taking place in the society. But without, of course, accepting everything. And democracy, I think if it's combined with love and unity, it's good for the church.
Right, thank you. So I don't have any more questions on the chat here.
Then Davra has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, come closer. Come here.
So I have one brief comment and a question. So about this bishop dress and whether it's necessary or not, it is worth remembering that partly, from as far as we can tell, from the very beginning, there was some kind of power element attached to that, because even the earliest images depicting the way bishops were dressed actually shows us that it was patricians' clothes.
Yeah.
So it was not just an ordinary or any type of cloth. So there was this element attached to that. The second thing is that there is a relationship with the priestly service in the temple period, and there is also symbolism. So I wouldn't that easily dismiss the symbolic part of everything that happens in the liturgy, including the priestly attire, because there is a symbolism there as a way of communicating something else. So it might be that it's not the symbol that's a problem, but rather that we attach to certain symbols or symbolic mediation the element of power and hierarchy, which doesn't need to be there. So in other words, I don't think that the only way out is to dismiss certain types of clothes or symbols, but rather to rethink their function. And another, just a brief comment to that, you talked about the distinct type of headdress in the case of bishops of Alexandria and the absence of that in other bishops. It might be, this is purely speculation, but it might be related, first of all, to the strong presence of the headdress in Egypt in the pre-Christian traditions of certain types that actually are similar to this one. The second, an interesting fact is that in ancient Greek and Roman times, the Greek way of serving was without headdress, with head uncovered. The Roman way was with head covered. So it might also be that influence that when Christianity actually arrived, it actually faced two distinct modes of dealing with head covers in the Greco-Roman world, and it might be the case, as it often happens, that in outside of the capital, traditions remain more strongly present than inside the capital. And finally, the question, you used an interesting formulation toward the end of your presentation of theological democracy. Now, could you say something more about it? What you mean, or what could we possibly, how we could understand that concept of theological democracy, and given all the baggage that the concept of democracy comes with, in the modern period, most of it's not really very nice. Wouldn't it be a better idea to use the term anarchy instead of democracy?
So he added in the end his feel of anarchy. To admit that I accept the term anarchy, that would be good to go too far. You almost tricked me there. But first of all, I think you're completely right, Dafor. I think that we cannot dismiss power. Any organization has power, and also the early church and everything. I think you're completely right that even though homophorine is a sign of power, I think it's just that why investing symbols of power with the empire? That's my question. Why? Simply because in the church in that period, of course, that was how we were connected with power. But the question is, should we continue with that? But I do think that power will be a part. Power is still an operative manner in any organization, and especially in a community that emphasizes unity. And that's the second part of what you're talking about, theological democracy. We cannot say democracy as we do in a civil society, because a democracy is not unified, and it shouldn't be unified. The idea of democracy in a civil society is simply that we are still living together, even if we are completely in a disagreement, whether it's anarchy or hierarchy, still we have to live together. That's the condition of democracy. The church is not conditioned by being in a disagreement. No, we have to be in agreement, which means that we cannot talk of democracy in a civil sense. We need to have a different way of understanding this. And it's complicated, I would say. And when I use the term theological democracy, I'm talking about procedural democracy, normally at least when I lecture, meaning that you must accept pluralism even in the church, but not as an end station. Pluralism as the first condition towards unity. Unity without pluralism, it's nothing. It's just potential. It means that someone is deciding on top of everyone else. So theological democracy for me would mean that a bishop, if you take a bishop, for example, that would have an ecclesial democratic mind, would encourage pluralism before unity. But I don't mean pluralism in the sense that instead of unity, but before, in the process of achieving unity. And this is also the theological position by Maximus the Confessor. He talks about the plurality, the pleroma of a church is within each individual. But Christ is the kephalo, and the process is anakephalysis, it's recapitulation. That actually the bishop is bringing the disagreements, the various standings, into a position in front of Christ, which is unified. But unity here means that still disagreement can exist in a certain framework, in a certain way. It doesn't need to be dismissed entirely. And Maximus is trying to explain this in Ambigua 7, I think it is. Now, I'm not really sure, so I think it's Ambigua 7 that is explaining this. But it takes a stand that the plurality still exists in unity. It never disappears. And of course, this is a complicated discussion, which will be in second lecture, I would say. But I fully agree with you, Daffer, that power will always remain with an institution like the church, especially if you talk about unity. But the question is, must it be in terms of an empire, whether it's a present-day empire or a past empire? That's probably mine. And I hope you're accepting that I'm not advocating your anarchy concept straight ahead, even if it has some benefits, I would argue.
All right, thank you. Would you like to add anything else? I didn't want to interrupt you before you were done.
No, it's
okay. Very good. Are there other questions which, let's see. Thank you for the interesting lecture. We need the material if it is possible. I take it that means the PowerPoint slides, the outlines. I don't know if that's possible or not.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
But I have to check it with Bojana, our head of communication. So I'm not doing something illegal here.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Goodness, this is. There's so much I would ask, but I'll wait to ask you my questions the next time we have an opportunity to talk further. I especially appreciated your outlining the ways in which Schmemann's theology has had, let's say, less than salutary effects upon the church in the second half of the 20th century. And I thank you for mentioning some points that I hope to elaborate on in my own lecture coming up. So, thank you for that.
Yes.
Anyone else? I'm getting lots of thanks here for the lecture. And so if there aren't any other questions, just to say thank you again for this stimulating, thought-provoking lecture. And I'm sure that everyone who's listened is looking forward to continuing the conversation with you in various formats. So with that, we'll conclude today's lecture. Thank you all very much for attending and for participating. And the next lecture, if I understand the schedule correctly, will be by Dr. Johanna Youssef. I don't have a title for Dr. Johanna's lecture yet. Does anybody have one? I don't think so yet. Okay, but his lecture will be next in the series on the 5th of November, and so welcome to attend that. So with that, thank you again, Michael, and thank you all. I wish you all a good day, and stay healthy and safe wherever you're at.